Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dhar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdhar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Angela Hawken, who is the director of the Marron Institute at NYU. Marron is an applied think tank that works with governments to create and enact better policies through the use of technology and data. Angela has spent a lot of time on the ground dealing with district attorneys, correctional officers, offenders, judges, and various government agencies. I think of her as doing AI and experimentation in the wild. Angela, welcome to Brave New World. Truly delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me here, Vasant. Good to see you.
Well, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you and to Lucy, who we co-parent.
We do indeed. We do indeed. So, one of the things that my listeners may not be aware of is that you are the voice of my podcast.
I am indeed. And what they might also not know now that they're hearing me live is that you lowered my voice by an octave, the Margaret Thatcher credibility.
I did indeed. And I think it works really well with the music and everything. So thanks again for doing it. Really appreciate it. So Angela, tell us your story, all the way from the beginning, like what influenced you growing up, where'd you go to school, and how did you end up running the Marron Institute here at NYU?
So I'm originally from South Africa, as you can tell from the accent. When I was a grad student, I was kind of one of those scrappy grad students who was really seriously resource constrained and had to make subject selection based on the price of textbooks. So I went with wherever the textbooks were cheap, and that pushed me into mathematical economics and econometrics, and I'm really grateful for that path. And early on was recruited to join the faculty of the university that I was at. My tenure there coincided with a kind of a avalanche of sabbaticals, and so they threw me into teaching classes that I'd often not taken before, and I was very young at the time, often much younger than my students. And
I remember that. Fire.
It was a stressful but fascinating time, and I loved my students. My undergrad classes had 300-400 stat students at a time, and teaching a large class like that was just so fun. And then my grad classes were small, and I was teaching game theory and macroeconomics and microeconomics and everything they threw my way, because as a young faculty member they have no mercy. But I love teaching in Africa. My favorite teaching, I think, has been in Africa. My students came to class with a thirst to learn. They were so ready and so excited. And so I was really happy there.
And so how did you end up in the U.S.?
So that's a sadder story. It really involves 3 gun events that happened in really short order just before I left. The first was I was shot at in a drunk driving accident, and somebody rear-ended me and decided to leave no evidence and got out of the car and just started shooting. And then a few weeks later, I was taken hostage, which was a very stressful situation. I wasn't harmed in any of these encounters, but they were really eye-opening.
Wait, so these happened like
short
one after
order?
The other?
They were all within 2 months. 3,
Wow.
And then the last one was a good old-fashioned mugging. At the time, just a regular old gun-involved mugging seemed like an easy one.
Yeah.
But it just was too many too quickly, and I needed to get away just to decompress for a while. And had an invitation from the Rand Corporation, from Rand. They'd seen me present at the African Econometric Society, and had sent me an offer in the mail. And I wasn't planning to take it, and then immediately decided I would take it because I needed to just get out for a while. And went to Rand. And
was that in Los Angeles?
That was in Santa Monica. Just beautiful location.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to go work somewhere, let it be Rand, Santa Monica.
Yeah.
And ended up doing their doctoral program in policy analysis. I was, teaching econ at the time, and it really shaped my interests. And very soon I was recruited to do some teaching at Pepperdine, and then joined the faculty there. And that was fascinating because my students, more so than I think most programs anywhere in the US, my students were... I would run elections, like prior to an election, and see what the vote would look like. And it would be like could go either way. My students were just evenly split, liberal and conservative, and that made for a really healthy teaching environment for me, at least. It was really great to keep, checking my thinking on things and make sure that I could learn from them and they could learn from me. That was a good time. And then Paul Romer came along, and he saw my work on really how do we create more ideas in the government sector? How can we push the idea economy along? Was excited about that work and recruited me to Marron, and then I soon then took over his position at Marron as director.
AAA. So Angela, how did you get interested in crime? You spent a fair amount of time in prisons and have all kinds of experiences with the criminal justice system and law enforcement. How did you get into this area?
Oh, just in my early days of joining RAND, I had been doing very different work in South Africa, but by the time I'd had these 3 events, became interested in crime and became interested in human behavior, not from a victim's perspective, which is what some people would be concerned about, but really just through this fascination about what drives people to take on towards certain actions. And the day I was taken hostage, I was locking eyes with the man who had me in assassination position, and looking into the eyes of someone like that, crime stats are very,
What do you have, was he pointing a gun at you?
Yeah. No, he told me he was going to kill me, and I expected him to. And usually in that situation, they rarely end well. So I was very, very lucky. But I looked at his eyes, and I thought, well, they looked like the eyes that could have been my brother's. My brother has dark eyes and very similar, it's a similar way of looking at you. And I thought, this could be my brother, and I think he's going to kill me. And suddenly, everything gets so much more complicated when you see the person who you're most scared of in the world as a human being, and trying to understand what led him. And he also just looked terrified. We both seemed very unhappy about being in that place at that time. So that led to my interest. So when I got to RAND, I was initially working as an econometrician on some civil work there, and was really interested in joining their crime unit. And Peter Greenwood at the time interviewed me, and he said, "Why am I interested?" And I said, "Well, there were these 3 gun events." And he said, "Stop a minute, stop right there. Not going to happen. Not going to have you on the team." And it took me a while to convince him I really was in this for the right reasons, and I wanted to learn. And he dragged me off to maximum security prison in California, so I could get my first experiences in the system. And it was my first day in prison, and I've now done many, 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 many prison visits. My first day in prison was meeting with juveniles who were tried as adults. They were a juvenile unit attached to a maximum security adult facility. And meeting those kids that day, and the teaching and the teachers and the counselors, it was very aware quickly how complicated life is. And it really raised concerns with me about the value of deterrence. These kids had no idea what sort of sentences they might face. And they were there for so many different reasons. And as I started to do adult work too, you just realize the complexity of these institutions and who they're holding.
So these were juveniles who done, some really seriously bad shit.
Well, they were juveniles who were sentenced under strike laws. So California was had one of the strictest versions of what's called the 3 strikes law. So 3 strikes and you're out. The idea is that you'd be, 25 to life. And these kids often, they really varied. I mean, some of them came from families that had long histories of violence, and others were really just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and something went bad. And under the strike laws, they accumulated really quickly, and they were now going to spend a life in prison. And all over, you found these kids with very different circumstances, and just realizing that they were going to be there for the rest of their lives, potentially. And yes, the underlying offenses were typically very serious. Now, on the adult side, there was different. When I was working with the 3 strikers on the adult side in California, so many people there were just... it was really a system that was horribly implemented at the time. A serious felony, a serious residential theft in California, stealing a bike from a garage counted. So if you stole a bicycle out of a garage that was attached to a house, it was a residential burglary. A couple of those and you were a striker, and gone for good. Yeah. And not all the cases, I don't want to characterize this as everybody there was just an unfortunate soul, but it was very messy and very complicated. And I'm grateful to RAND for the opportunity to get my early days under the belt.
So tell us a little bit more about Marron, because it's an unusual sort of an institute.
Marron is weird by design, and I love that about it. It's a think-do tank based at a university, and we take the thinking part and the doing part equally seriously. So it is an applied research shop that also does a lot of building. So we're like setting up new things somewhere or setting up or creating new technology. But all of it is on the front lines of working with the government sector or with nonprofits to do something differently. So it's very much, I call it often kind of also the last mile research, where some technology might be emerging, but it isn't being adopted where it needs to be adopted. And we kind of a team that can go push it in, get things done. I'll give a couple of examples of the work that we do at Marron. One of my faculty members I love to talk about is Solly Angel, who is he's an urban planner. And Solly, I think, is one of my academic heroes because he is a field changer in a way that took so much courage. And I wish more academics had this sort of courage. He realized the field was wrong. And Max Planck talks about how science evolves one funeral at a time. Well, I'm glad that in this case...
what do you mean by the field was wrong?
So at the time, there was great densification was happening in cities. So people were moving towards cities. So lots of urbanization. And planners were trying to decide how they would accommodate that growth, particularly in lower income countries. And so the field, people were going down. If you had an expert from the US coming down, an urban planner or someone coming to advise your country or your city planners or your city managers, they would arrive with their briefcases and immediately tell you how to densify by building up, making buildings taller, and by filling in, so putting buildings between buildings. So in other words, they were trying to densify while staying within the footprint of a city. And so the idea was to avoid kind of urban growth, urban sprawl, all those negative things that come with that tag. But Solly realized, well, this is nice, that's how they want to densify, but in practical reality, that's not how densification is happening. What's happening, he had spent decades working in the field, he was noticing that cities really were growing outwards. So he started to use satellite images and tagging data to start to characterize density. And what he found is where people were being accommodated as they flocked into urban areas wasn't in buildings going up or in, but it was on the periphery of cities. And because they weren't planning for that growth, bad things happen at the periphery of low-income cities. Squalor, really. I mean, it's informality. There's no trunk infrastructure. The sewer lines don't get laid down. The electrification isn't there. So what he had to do was really spend a decade taking that satellite data, showing how cities are growing, showing where the densification is actually happening, and convincing the field that they had it wrong.
And was this globally when you're talking
about
cities?
So he started off, initially he started with a sample of 200 cities globally, and showed, these animations are fascinating to watch. See how these cities have changed over time. And what you see is they grow out, not up, right?
Yeah. No, I've actually seen some of them.
Those animations are beautiful. Mm-hmm. And so initially he did it for a global city of 200. Now his plan is to do it, thanks to modern technology, he's planning to do this for every city that has a population of greater than 50,000. And then overlay all the maps, so making sure that these cities are able to grow in ways that are climate resilient and again, can make space for residents to live there, but live there with good quality of lives.
What about some of the other initiatives?
So we have our Civic Analytics program really makes sure that their government partners have access to the analytical tools that they need. And they were invited by a city to come in to address a 311 problem that they had. So
311 for the listeners is...
So 311 is the non-emergency line. So you're calling because there's a pothole on your street that's an inconvenience, or there's flooding happening, and there's some water leak and it's causing problems. And calls come in. And what the city was concerned with doing was making sure that there was an equitable response to the calls that came in. So the system that they put in place to make sure they were being fair was one that was first in, first out. So as the calls came in by type, they would then send out service. So the service calls would be addressed. But what they didn't take into consideration at the time was that squeaky wheels are not evenly distributed over a city. Some neighborhoods are much more prone to complaining than others. And it turned out that in lower-income neighborhoods, the need was much higher, because Constantine's team looked at this. The need was much higher, but the calls for service was much lower. So ultimately what the team did was develop algorithms that would upweight service calls from areas that had low propensities to complain, so that ultimately they could get a response system that was fair and serviced the city appropriately.
And how do you evaluate something like that? How did it actually work out? How did you say, all right, solved, well done?
Well, because they still have complaints data, right? So they can see, and then they can go back and see what was done. And so they were constantly within themes, making sure that they were tagging data, seeing what was being done in response to the data, and ultimately ended up. There's some great papers on this. That team does a really good job of publishing in Nature and Science. So there's lots of data on this now, and showing how it all shook loose. But I think the lesson of that is that sometimes we don't know what our problems are until outsiders come and spend some time looking at our data with us. I mean, that's often when we go into a government partner, it might be the first time that they see their data that way and they see their problems differently. And then, of course, I'm a big fan of finding algorithms that can help us do things more smartly.
Yeah. So my sort of naive view of what you do is sort of, I'm not going to call it AI in the wild, but experimentation in the wild, in government and urban settings and all of that through, randomized control trials and all that good stuff. So tell us a little bit more about, some of these initiatives and what your experience has been.
I'm perfectly happy with having the label of going wild in the government sector. It's because that's where we have the most fun and where we drive the most impact. So I started off really being very squarely interested in randomized control trials and was doing, and one of the reasons Paul Romer recruited me to NYU, because I was able to get them done quickly and in a lot of places. And these were scrappy. These were pragmatic field experiments where we really wanted to change the approach to doing research. The traditional approach to doing research doesn't really serve the government sector very well, to be honest, mostly. It's very slow, and government timelines are quite aggressive in terms of turnover. Positions change very quickly. And if the
faster than your project
faster
completion.
than the research, typical research, right? Yeah. And if the leader is leaving in 18 months, but the research is coming out in 4 years, then no one cares about that research anymore. And often we see research come out, especially if it's research on some new program or new technology. By the time the research comes out, they don't even use that anymore. It's so redundant. So we needed to find ways to make research happen more quickly. I also really was inspired by Bezos' approach to reducing the cost of testing at Amazon. He talked about how we needed to drive down the cost of running experiments so we could learn more. So I was really trying to figure, how can we reduce the cost of doing experiments? And the insight was that our government partners, if they were integrated into the research process, they have access to the data. A big part of a researcher's problem when you're setting up a project that makes it go slowly is just data use agreements, access, getting willingness to let them into your institutions. But if these are their ideas, their institutions, their data, the whole process can move really, really quickly. But what
So give me an example, by the way, of like a randomized control trial that you thought was like really cool, and maybe one that wasn't, and
Yeah, the first one I did, and at the time it wasn't something that was happening a lot. This is the mid-teens, 2010s. I noticed that my doctor's office was sending me a text message reminder for a doctor's appointment, and they just weren't doing this. Like very, very minimally, we're doing this in the government sector. So we were working with the probation department, and I said, "Hey, my doctor's sending me messages for reminders. When your probationers don't show up for an appointment, you're sending law enforcement after them. They're going to get arrested. So the consequences of them showing up, it's pretty serious." What I loved about this, Vasant, I was at Pepperdine at the time. The whole thing, we had a phone call on Wednesday. I think by the following week, we were already running a randomized control trial. It took about a week to get to a trial, and it took 6 weeks after that.
And so
we
the
had
trial
results.
was texting
people to show up.
Others.
Exactly, a randomized control trial. Half of them received the text, half they didn't. They'd increased the show-up rate significantly. Many fewer people were arrested, and it unleashed a lot more of that.
When was this? Which year was
it?
This?
It would have been probably 2012, 13,
Wow,
14.
Because that's become like pretty standard practice now, right?
No,
like
absolutely.
Everyone's sending you texts all the time saying, "Here's a reminder."
But it was also such a low cost. I remember they used a platform at the time, some technology to send out the text messages, and I think the whole thing cost them about $100. And dramatic improvements in show up, which of course was so expensive and bad for the person, because not only was somebody going to get arrested, that person is going to spend a couple of nights in jail in that state, given how they were operationalizing probation failures. So it was a win-win, and it really showed me the power of getting them involved. They were very excited. It solved a specific problem for them. So we unleashed this approach, and Pennsylvania really was my favorite state to do this. We said, just bring us your problems. We'll work with you on figuring out how to get them tested. And staff, we did a lot of work in corrections. Staff came to us with all sorts of problems, like, whether it's violence reduction or how to incentivize people, anything. We would just run it through their general counsel. If general counsel approved it, NYU approved it, we were out the door and got so much experimentation done. But what I really noticed in that work, when you do a lot of experiments, I wasn't actually ever interested in the specific experiment. I was interested in how they learn. When you're in the organizations, so much of the learning is actually happening on the side of the experiment. Like the important things are actually figuring out how their data systems work, what the culture of this organization is. So I was really interested in how they learn and how to unleash that learning. And that's when I started getting a much keener sense for the importance of place. Not everything generalizes. So we have to create knowledge locally, because if something works great, even if proven by an RCT in place A, it might stink up a storm in place B. And this really is some of the replication crisis, I think, in the social sciences, is we have to not always expect things to replicate. We have to retest things in people's own backyards to make sure that things are working the way that they're like
So what's an example of that, where you're talking about like a lot of the learning occurs on the side.
Yeah.
Like, so what's an example of that, like on the side of the RCT?
Well, and I can actually give you a good example of that when it was, I was running a randomized control trial in a state that will remain unnamed. We were looking at reducing the term of probation supervision. So if people were sentenced to probation for 12 months versus 7 months, and they were trying to make it as short as possible, were they more likely to accept a diversion, not go to prison? And we're testing that outcome. And
what do you mean by diversion?
Oh, diversion means you get diverted to stay in the community rather than going to jail. So we were testing whether people, but what we found in the state, in this county, is that many fewer black defendants were accepting the offer. So
of
they'd
going
rather
for diversion? Really?
Yes.
Why would you
And
prefer to
it's
go to jail?
Not that uncommon to see people declining supervision instead of jail among black defendants that simply do not have faith in the system. So they think what's going to happen is you still have that sentence hanging over your head. So if I don't succeed on my term of community supervision, I'm still going to get hammered with a sentence. So I'm going to end up spending 18 months in probation and then having to do the jail time anyway. I may as well just do the jail time. It's not
so it's almost like you have to pass a probation test.
Well, you have to think you're going to have a high probability of passing the probation test for it to be worth the gamble. And we see that white defendants are much more likely to take that gamble than black defendants. And so this district attorney really wanted to shrink that divide. He didn't like the fact that the uptake rates were so much higher among his white defendants and black defendants, and wanted to see more diversion among his black defendants. So he said, what can we do? Let's try this. Let's see if we shrink the term of supervision, if they have more confidence in taking that bet. And so we did that. Well, we shrunk this is interesting. We shrunk the it gets to the question, I guess, of learning on the side. We shrunk the term of supervision, and yes, we did see an increase in uptake across the board, but we didn't see an improvement in outcomes, because what they didn't do at the same time, they shrunk the term of supervision, but they didn't shrink the requirements. There's a lot of hoops the government often makes you jump through if you're on supervision. Often it can be silly, busy work. Some of it's meaningful, some of it isn't.
So out of
curiosity, they didn't change the program.
Passing this, is it like quote unquote objective, or is it judgmental? Is an officer deciding whether you passed, or are you like taking off a bunch of boxes?
So when you are put onto probation or parole, you get conditions of supervision. So that's very clearly laid out. Typically, this is what your expectations are. So if you are subject to random drug testing, you'll show up and you'll test negative. If you have an office appointment, you have to show up. You may not have contact with the victim. There's a long list of things. You might have to have all sorts of treatment programs that you're required to enter into. Now, increasingly people are learning that the longer that list is, the more easy it is to trip somebody up. And
sure.
You make their lives so busy. I mean, that book on scarcity is really important here. When we put so much complexity on people who are already managing complex lives, we can make things worse for them. So I think the lesson there was they had to really shrink the conditions of supervision to make them more manageable so that people could succeed. So that's an example of learning on the side of learning. They weren't thinking about supervision conditions at all. They were just thinking about duration, and we learned things along the way. But in the meantime, we also learned a lot about their data, and I'll talk a little bit about that later.
This is fascinating, because it gets into, because my first reaction was, well, why wouldn't you take community service or probation or whatever? But I hadn't actually thought about all of the, requirements that
it's an expected value calculation.
Yeah, exactly.
People don't think of it in that way, but it's an expected value calculation.
And that's what someone is doing. They're saying, well, I could get caught, I'm smoking a joint and I flunk and then I go to prison anyway.
Absolutely.
Something like that.
For sure.
Wow.
And if you feel that you're going to have more scrutiny, and it does, if you're on supervision, there is more scrutiny. So people just aren't sure of their prospects for succeeding. And the more complicated the terms of supervision are, the less likely they are to want to take that gamble.
Wow. Wouldn't have thunk it. But makes a lot of sense. So, you talked about Marron being a think-do kind of tank. Mm-hmm. So doing means you actually build things. What kinds of things, have you built?
So we build a lot of tech. We do tech. A lot of software, a lot of builds. But I'm going to talk about it. Sometimes we also build programming. And the idea there is, I feel that sometimes you have to build it for them to come. if they haven't yet had the inspiration, sometimes pointing them in that direction. So I'll give one example of a project that I'm really proud of. We call it Graduated Reintegration Illinois. And the backstory to this is that for those of us who work in prisons, it's at some point you may have, it is an opportunity, although it's very disturbing, to watch somebody being released from prison. And so in this day, and as a state on the western side of the US, I was watching someone being released from prison, and it was released from a maximum security unit. So the prison guards arrived with a cage, really put him into the cage, shackled him, and off he went to the gate. And they shoved him through the gate and slammed the door behind him. And this man was given $20 and a bus ticket, coming out of a maximum security unit and expected to get on a bus and go off and thrive. And it occurred to me just how broken our system of release is, that, the day this man was in prisoner status, we were spending, a lot of money on him. But as soon as he was released into the community to be among us, we spent next to nothing on him because parole cost per day is very minimal. And I thought, this is not good for public safety, and it's also terrible for this man, because there are 2 days in your prison stay that are very stressful, depending on your circumstance. It's the day you arrive, and it's the day you leave. And that sort of stress can often cause or prompt really bad outcomes. So I said, let's rebuild the system. I told the story to my very close collaborator at the time at NYU, Mark Kleiman, who was a good friend and colleague who passed away recently. And he said, well, let's make it happen, Angela. Let's make it happen. He was also at Marron. So we wrote a paper called Graduated Reintegration, and that's about this idea of letting people come out of prison early, but that the money would follow them into the community for a while. So by letting that, you really moved resources around, and then we're setting them up for success rather than for failure in the community. Wrote a paper. I gave a talk at Brookings to a large audience in Washington, D.C., and I could tell everybody was like, oh, it's an interesting idea, but nice, theoretical concept. No one thought we could actually pull it off. And within a year, well, because a random person from NYU is going to show up to a state and say, I'd like some of your prisoners, please, to test this concept out, and I'm going to take them into the community while they're still prisoners, and I'm going to set them up for success. May I have some people, please? That conversation doesn't usually go well, but in this case...
Sounds pretty crazy to me.
It does, right? And that's what everybody in the room that day we gave that Brookings presentation was thinking. But within a year, I really think there's a lot of interest in getting this done well. So within a year, we had a state ready to play, we had a funder ready to play, and we were ready to roll. I'm really grateful to Unorthodox Philanthropy. They're an incredible funder, willing to fund out-of-the-box ideas. They were central to making this possible. And to NYU, our general counsel was involved. We held the leases on these apartments. These 60 men who came out of prison, NYU held their leases.
So hang on a second. Let me get this straight. You take a bunch of people who are still prisoners, and NYU gets rooms where they're housed.
Not rooms, apartments. We held the leases on 60 apartments. And for the first time in their lives, many of these men actually were in an apartment. And once they had secure employment, many of them became leaseholders for the first time. And that would have been unimaginable in any other counterfactual.
But how did you manage to pull something like this off, right? Because what happens if they commit a crime or, a more egregious crime while you have them in these apartments?
So it was really important that the state came to us. So we didn't go shopping for a state, right? The state came to us and said, we want to do this. Will you help us figure it out? So again, this is it's their program that they're trying, right? Vasant.
But who's taking the risk? Are you taking the risk?
We were all taking the risk. We worked very carefully to make sure that we had operational details in place. These men were coming home anyway. They were coming home 6 months later. The count of what coming home would have looked like had we not been involved in their lives would have been really, really bad.
Out of the prison.
If you look at recidivism out of the gates and people leave prison, the return to custody is so high. So it's not like we have a system that's doing so well and we're going to try something else. We have a system that has completely failed, and we're trying something that might have had. Depends on the state. It's often 2/3. 2/3 of them will go back. No. So it was really. It was really just a space that was desperately in need of reform, and we and then of course when the state got to recruiting who wanted to participate, this was all voluntary, of course, but you can imagine an announcement saying, right, who would like to get out of here 6 months early? You didn't have to work very hard to find people who were willing to play. And then they were being released in the way that really helped to set them up for success. They had an apartment to go to. They had counselors who were working with them on substance use disorder issues or any mental health needs. They were helped with employment readiness, any vocational training. They were given, living stipends, and they could go choose furniture and kettles, and they were released in a way that really gave them an opportunity to focus on the things that mattered, and that was reintegration. We learned a lot. We also learned a lot about challenges. In that, the real challenges of reentry and how very hard it is to do it right. But what was interesting, this was a 60-person project, and I say Marron is really focused on impact, and that small body of work led to transformative change in multiple states. I mean, multiple states changed their legislation off the back of that project. And there's now statutes that allow people to release early into very different sorts of conditions. So we're really proud of how what the outsized impact of that work was, even though we would completely redesign. If we did it again, it wouldn't look anything like what we did, because we've learned so much. We've also learned a lot about their data.
So when was this? Which year was this?
So we started in 2000, and the Brookings paper came out in 2015. We started work about it in 2000. We started work in 2016, and
when were these people released?
They started releasing in 2017. Yeah.
And what was the outcome of that experiment?
So
of the 60, what happened?
So we had very low. Life is complicated. We had really low, and they all had challenges. We weren't trying to pick people who had nothing going on in their lives. Many grappled with substance use needs, so we had to make sure. And I had an amazing team. I'm so grateful I hired incredibly strong woman to come and join me to make this project happen. And if the system was trying to do something we didn't approve of with one of our men, somebody on my team, Janelle Pruitt, so they rearrested one of our men. He had substance use disorder he'd used, and they threw him back in prison. She basically showed up and took him back. I mean, it took people with just guts and stamina who could work with agencies, help people realize what this person needs right now isn't a cell. He needs to be in treatment right now. This person's in crisis. So we were able to troubleshoot, and I think it was a really good learning exercise for the agency, because they got to be with people who saw the world in different ways and could introduce new research findings and new practices. But we got to learn about how complex it is to do this sort of thing well. And so the one thing I'm really proud of now is one of the biggest challenges our men faced was employment. When you're coming out of prison and looking for a job, which you have to do so quickly because you have nothing, right? For many of them, right? They have to get employed so quickly. Having that question about your history is very problematic. And as soon as people know that you're coming out of a system or coming out of incarceration, you get to know very quickly in that interview. And in my former life, I worked on labor economics, and I understand reservation wages and demoralization. And very quickly, people would get demoralized. They just didn't think there was a job for them, and they'd fall out of the labor market. And that is not just bad in terms of getting these people on a good track in life, but it's also bad for public safety. So if we don't solve that employment piece, we're really in trouble. And so this is where, in true Marron style, we started figuring out a solution to this. And so this is our new big project that we're just finishing. We're piloting right now. We're piloting and will soon be statewide. We built On Board, which is a tech solution for people who are in custody. It's essentially Indeed, the job matching tool, but for people in correctional settings. So employers are vetted, they're put in the system, they meet with, they start to interview people while they're in custody. Basically, the employment transaction happens before they're released, and they release into employment with somebody who knows they have a history, actually knows their skills, knows their challenges, and are really ready to set them up for employment on day one, which we think will be very impactful. So we built the technology, we're piloting it now, we'll be soon statewide in Illinois in 2025.
Wow.
And then what's so nice about this?
Who runs this platform?
We built it entirely, yeah. So we built it entirely, and we'll be statewide in Illinois in 2025. But what I love about this, as you know, Vasant, is technology is so scalable. We'll start to see how things work in Illinois. If it looks promising, this can go national so quickly. It's such an easy thing to pivot. So that's where I became so interested in what can technology do for us? Where can we get better? Once we know their data, once we become a trusted partner, and that's really important. You have to be sincerely interested in helping these government entities work better. And if you're sincere about that, if you're not looking for a cheap headline, because it's very easy to tell the world how much some group sucks, and many of them do. But if what you're really interested in is helping the people they serve, then you have to integrate with these agencies and help them do what they do better. And I think we've worked really hard to become a trusted partner.
And are these people tracked?
So we have data, and we can continue to do this over time. We know, so the return to custody was very low. This was not done as a randomized control trial. We would have had some challenges with that.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So this was just, we had a group, but we know by any reasonable comparison group, they've done really well. But we learned a lot, and I would never replicate the same thing. We would replicate something similar but very different. And the new legislation that's picked up off the back of this, I think we're seeing a lot of the elements, but some modifications that we've actually suggested along the way. But I definitely became less interested in randomized control trials when I started to see the power of just their data. So the same county we were running that experiment on probation, that district attorney, and I think it's very important to note that this was a Republican elected district attorney. And he came to our office. We had just running an experiment, so we knew a little bit about their data, and we were safe space. I mean, I think a lot of district attorneys are very scared of academics because usually, we're mostly angry at them, and for good reason. There's lots that goes wrong in district attorneys' offices. But he came with data. We didn't even know he was arriving. He had a thumb drive in his pocket. He came to NYU to see us, and he brought data on a thumb drive. And he said, Angela, I went to a lecture a few weeks ago on brain science and understanding like how young brains work differently from mature brains and risk-seeking behavior and all these things. Can you tell me about my prostitution caseload? And he brought a thumb drive. He had people in his office collect data, and he brought this thumb drive. And I took him to lunch on Fifth Avenue, and we were away just for that period of lunch. When we came back, our data scientist was ready to go. It wasn't even an hour, right? I mean, I keep talking about the returns to 20 minutes of good data science. And we just showed him his caseload, his prostitution caseload. And the first thing, he was just absolutely floored, by how young they were, and then how a bigger percentage of this caseload was Black. And he said to us, Angela, I don't understand this. Well, that they're young is really problematic because I don't know that we're doing right by them in terms of how we're trying to help them. But what's even more concerning to me is that this is a primarily Black caseload. My county has almost no Black people. So where are these Black people coming from? And so we started to understand what was going on, and we eventually found out that law enforcement was running sting operations and really luring women over the county line. It was entrapment. And so he confronted law enforcement. They denied it. Luckily, the same data scientist, nothing evaporates on the internet, and we could find the postings where they were putting ads that these women were responding to. And very quickly, he just stopped practices, and they changed how they manage their prostitution caseload. And very quickly, that went to the AG's office, and it reformed practice statewide. It was the quickest return to time ever in my career. It was so quick how reform happened off the back of data. And he said to me, I remember him looking me in the eye that day, and he said, Angela, I had no idea this was happening. I've already been the DA for 10 years. I would have stopped this a decade ago if I'd only known. What else is going on? What else is happening in my backyard that I don't know? And I want to run a fair system. So we started a beautiful partnership that day. Now we have access to their data. We've built amazing data tools for them. He can always know exactly what's happening in their system, and other lawyers can too. Much more transparency, much better fairness as a result. And they really are. We're building a tool called Know Now. We've just finished our first, this December, finished our first pilot of that, where they have immediate access to information, and we're starting to automate evaluation, which is a big step for the government sector.
Wow, super, super cool. I have very limited experience with government. I mean, most of my dealings are with business, but I get the sense that people don't want to share their data because there's only downside, right? I mean, typically data will only reveal how incompetent or badly run a place is, isn't it? Is that what you find?
Absolutely. So there's two ways that they're scared of their data. The first is that outsiders will realize how bad their data is. And I don't know that people realize enough just disarray of our digital public infrastructure. Digital infrastructure is a mess. So the data hostings are bad, the quality of the data is bad, and then they're scared about what you're going to find that they might not even know of. Like, what are you going to see about their operations that they aren't otherwise aware of? So they're very concerned about lawsuits. What we have always done is position ourselves as a trusted partner. We will help you learn from your data, and then it's your responsibility to do the right thing. Like, as long as we will be your ally in this, as long as you're ready to do the right thing if we find something, if it's crappy data, you're going to start improving your data record keeping. If it's something happening in practices, you're going to make sure those practices stop now. And that's the relationship we've tended to have, and we've had really great partnerships off the back of that approach.
What other stuff have you done with law enforcement that's interesting? And here, I'm sort of reminded of my, I had an incident, I don't know, how long has it been now? 4 months, 6 months, something like that, where, I was pulled over by a cop and treated relatively poorly, and I complained. Fortunately, I managed to keep my cool, even though I felt like I was being, treated badly and, in a completely undignified kind of way. I mentioned this to you after this happened, and you said, well, I'm glad it didn't escalate because these things can go south really quickly. When do they go south?
Well, first, Vasant, you did the right thing by trying to keep your cool. And it's hard to do that because fairness is so primal. You were poorly treated. You felt that you'd been unfairly treated. And fairness is primal from a very young age. We have a distinct sense of right and wrong. And if we've been treated unfairly, we just get angry. And that anger can lead to behaviors that can escalate really quickly on both sides. And then if the person who's been confronted by the officer is escalating, the officer is going to escalate, and things can go wrong. Now, I do know in your case that you complained to the officer, but not to the police chief. It's really important that if something happens to you that's unfair or seems wrong, that those complaints be filed. Otherwise, you just don't give the police chiefs, you aren't arming them with the data that they need to take action. So the first thing, if someone's doing something to make sure that that is on record, we partner with a lot of law enforcement agencies, and we are seeing a lot of both on training. There's a lot of emphasis now on de-escalation, trying to improve rapport with the community, and also testing new technologies. The field has taken a huge reputational blow, and it's really problematic for law enforcement. We work with a lot of departments now that are struggling to recruit. They're providing sign-on bonuses, whether it's $20,000 or $50,000, and still struggling to recruit. And this is at a time when police chiefs are trying to be much more discerning about who they hire. They want to be much more careful, but the supply is now so limited. So we really have to resolve this reputation problem, like law enforcement. And I think there's lots to be done there. But it is a strange time for law enforcement. But I do think that we see this is where technology can be a friend. But Vasant, my lesson to you there, and anybody listening, if you have a negative encounter with law enforcement, to make sure it's on record.
Now, I noticed that he had a body cam, which actually that surprised me, but someone told me later that that's actually a good thing, because there's less room for them to really go rogue. Do you know whether this technology has helped? Have encounters become, quote unquote, better than they used to be?
So I never asked you the question. Do you know if his was on during the start?
It was on. I actually asked him. I said, do you have it on? He says, yes, I do. I said, well, that's interesting. You never asked me. He says, no, I'm required to have it on, which was...
So in that case, that gave both of you protection. So we are seeing with body-worn cameras that we're seeing both reductions in complaints by the public. So the public is less likely, someone's less likely to make a complaint arbitrarily. So people are more discerning about when they file a complaint. And we're seeing, fewer incidents. So body-worn cameras are definitely helping. And in that case, and it would be an evidence you can point to if things really went wrong. And it should have actually made you feel more comfortable in that interaction. Just knowing that camera was on would constrain his behavior in that encounter. So you should have had a little bit of relief. Now, it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work. We have horrible situations.
But I only realized he had that body cam about 15, because my incident lasted, 40 minutes. I only realized this 10 or 15 minutes into the thing that I saw this, and I said, is this being recorded? Because, and then I was like, oops, I hope I haven't said anything, particularly bad. But if I had known he'd had it on, it would have altered my behavior from the beginning as well. I probably would have been less belligerent, because at some point I said, what? How long are you going to make me do? And he said, well, keep raising your leg until I tell you to stop. I said, no, I'm not doing that. You got to tell me what the criterion is. What are you testing and what do I need to pass this thing, So I guess if I
those seem like reasonable questions to me that you're asking.
But I was getting pissed off.
So that's exactly. I think body-worn cameras are kind of helping. I think it's on both sides, but the public is recognizing that again. I think both sides are just more careful in that interaction, which is for the best. So I do think there's a lot of and again, technology can be our friend here. There's body-worn cameras. There's much more tech being used now in terms of de-escalation training. We're learning more about dispatch and how people are thinking what information comes to the officers when they even go up to somebody in the field. But just as there's a lot of promise, I think we also have to be very careful about the adoption of technology in the law enforcement space. And we've been doing some work in this. Law enforcement is a specific area where these are people who basically have the opportunity to remove your freedoms. That's a lot of responsibility. So whenever tech is being applied, it would be nice to see much more understanding of the tech, where the tech can go wrong. And I want to give one example, because this was really striking for me. We did some work with the police department in California on automated license plate readers. So these are, for those of you who don't know, there's lots of static cameras. Wherever you live, there's going to be static cameras collecting information as you go past, and they can read license plate numbers, and they can match it against a database. Let's say of some, is there somebody, is there a kidnapping? Is this a wanted person for whatever reason? And so we were doing a randomized control trial on the use of automated license plate readers. Now, these are license plate readers that are attached to the car, the police vehicle itself. And so as they're driving around, so it means that they're not just in one place. It gives them more exposure because they're driving around in the world. So we randomized vehicles to having ALPR technology in them. What we found, and again, this is another example of the most important lesson being on the side of the research. We found, yes, they were very effective at pinging and finding matches, and the cars were being alarmed all the time to the fact that this is somebody in our database for whatever. And very quickly that they learned two things. The one was, be very careful what you're matching on. Make sure it's only high value targets, like basically make it for serious things only, because otherwise this technology is so good that it's basically alarming all the time, and the officers just stop paying attention to it. They just get worn out, fatigue, right? Ping fatigue. It's ping, ping, ping. Just get fatigued. But more important, I think, from a fairness perspective, is that department had no idea what the false positives were on those matches. We found out, I think it was nearly a quarter or a third of them were false positives. So the officers were approaching those vehicles thinking that car had a perpetrator in it, and it simply was not true. So these sorts of things where we have research on the side.
They're getting the license plate wrong?
Yeah, it's a mystery.
Pathetic.
It's wrong.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. And of course, the technology is going to get better with time, but we need to know these mistakes so that an officer is primed with the knowledge of, please confirm that this match is true before you approach that vehicle. So we don't have, again, another sense of fairness, right? If somebody gets approached as though there's this villain and they aren't, I mean, you lose faith in government. You lose faith in institutions, and it's bad for us all. So
yeah, I mean, no kidding. Like a colleague of mine, a professor, he and I had gone for a drink in the East Village. We left. I came home. He walked home. And, next thing you know, he's like one block away, and a cop comes and slams him against the wall, and he ended up spending a night in prison because he looked like someone they were looking for, and he happened to be black. I told him, I said, I would sue them. He's like, it's like I'm never going to get anywhere. It's like too much hassle.
Yeah, I think drawing attention to these sorts of injustices is really important. Keep more scrutiny, keep the heat on this sort of thing, and it is. So I think we have to be very careful. There's a lot of promise with the technology, and sometimes we really want people to be found and quickly. But there's also these concerns, these cautionary tales. But I definitely, in general, I think there's so much opportunity for AI in all of the agencies we certainly work with.
So talking about AI, there was a lot of attention on this compass system, right, for sentencing decisions, and of course, criminal justice system is using data, they're using AI. People criticized it for perpetuating bias. The developers in response said that it was actually very well calibrated. How do you view the role of AI in that type of decision making? I mean, should sentencing decisions be inherently human? Should they be machine based? Like, how do you think about this?
So this is a complicated issue, and I'm not going to talk about Compass itself because there's many similar sorts of instruments that are either, using these algorithms to assess either the risk of somebody reoffending, or the need. So how the agency is going to respond on the need side, and the problem is that with all of these risk assessment tools, the input data to this is the observance of some prior offense, right? Usually. So this is the other joke about a lot of these instruments. I have colleagues who've written on this, that these are tools that governments pay a lot of money to use. And actually, the data already in their systems does pretty well and sometimes better at predicting risk than these expensive tools. So why are we spending money to begin with? I question the entire endeavor for some of this. But the risk that risk data coming in is it's really two things going on. That if you look at people's priors, right, we are not equally likely to have a prior given a certain behavior. So if you live in a neighborhood that's heavily policed, if you you are going to have much higher risk of having a prior arrest, even if, and it's the same. It's assuming everybody is guilty, and in many cases they are not. But let's say people have committed this act. There's variation by neighborhood and variation by socioeconomic status, and who's actually going to pick up the arrest as a result of that. And on the same thing on the output data, when they look at the risk, are people recidivating? That same thing is going to follow people in the community. So I'm at elevated risk of an arrest if I'm somebody living in a community where there's going to be more arresting behavior too. So it's both the person's behavior and the system's behavior, and those get conflated, which make both enter into these models. So it becomes very difficult to think about how do you debias a lot of these systems? And that's where I think what the public are calling for. And greater transparency. What's so ridiculous about some of these tools is just how black box they are. And this is my concern with a lot of the tech providers in general. And a lot of government agencies fall victim to this, is they give up their data and then just have no standing in terms of asking, like, how are these things calculated? Like, what's actually going on here? And everybody's protecting their proprietary information. It's like, no, we're not going to tell you what our black box is. That's how we make our money. But, we should, I think when it comes to the public sector, and especially on law and order, especially when you have the opportunity to remove someone's freedom, the standards for transparency should be so much higher.
In fact, when people talk about AI perpetuating bias, I think that's sort of really sloppy thinking, right? Where you just take data and you build a model and you say, all right, here it is, right? That's just, especially for like really high sort of cost of error situations like this, right? It seems to me that the role of AI should be exactly the opposite, right? It should be to expose the kinds of biases we have. Someone was talking about the fact that they used a lot of, AI vision algorithms to analyze a whole bunch of cases, and when they adjusted for all of the usual factors like severity of crime, race, whatever you want to, including all the relevant variables, the thing that explained the difference in sentencing was how gaunt someone looked, right? So if you're going to be if you're going to be a bad boy, it's better to be chubby than gaunt, right? And so you think about that and you say, like, is this some sort of deep-seated evolutionary bias that humans have accumulated, that's making its way into the criminal justice system, right? And if so, yeah, I wouldn't want that kind of a, bias to be perpetuated, especially if I'm a skinny person.
So when last I checked, BMI was not supposed to be factored into sentencing calculations according to sentencing guidelines. So it's horrible. I mean, and this is the power of data, right? And being able to detect these patterns that no one might be aware of. My sense in a case like that, it might be that at sentencing, the person might not be thinking this, but seeing somebody who's on the light side, they might think that means substance use disorder. A lot of people are underweight. So it could be that they're thinking this means something else, and without even realizing it, factoring that into sentencing. Yeah. But we've seen really the opposite case too, where obviously there's concern about bias, and that's why we should have more transparency. And in the same tools we've been building as a data tech partner to the state, our initial partner, the county that they were in, the district attorney was very worried about people who are undocumented and that there might be too punitive in managing those cases. Because when at the time of making a decision about what the state's going to ask for, they'll look at your priors. And one thing we found is that lawyers are very bad at counting. This is another good reason to bring in technology.
Doctors too, by
they would often do it on their fingers. We'd watch them count felonies and misdemeanors on their fingers, and they'd just get it wrong, and you realize they're losing some fingers along the way. And because when somebody has a history that's a little bit more complicated than a couple of things, then counting can go wrong really, really quickly. And they just see a lot, and then but they might not understand what's in that lot. I mean, that could be a lot of nothing or a lot of really serious things. And they also have to make decisions so quickly. And this was so terrifying to see in our work, is how so many consequential decisions are made about people's lives within a matter of minutes. But it is how where I see promise now in the tools that we've built for them is being able to really characterize those priors in a way that allows them to make much more sophisticated decisions, and also allows the philosophy of the district attorney to shape what those lawyers see. So in this case, this district attorney said, in my county, in my state, it's not possible for an undocumented person to have a legal pathway to a driver's license. I don't want my lawyers to take any of those driving without a license priors into consideration when they're making a decision. And so we were able to just turn that off. So, they could just say, this is what I want them to focus on. This is what I don't want them to focus on when they're making these decisions. So we could actually start to really de-bias the system too. As long as we're transparent about what's there, interacting with their data, I think we can move forward on this with these sorts of tech.
You appear to be, very pro-tech and bullish on AI. So what are some of the major challenges we face, that government faces, and what kind of guardrails do we need going forward?
So first, before I'm going to name some challenges, but I want to be very clear, very bullish on AI. I think this is absolutely the direction we're going to go. I think it's going to help us unleash more fairness, not less. I think it's going to mean we're going to be much more efficient at delivering services for the public than we have before. But there are big challenges. The agencies we encounter just are not ready. They're just not prepared to benefit from new technology and from AI in general. They don't have the expertise to make good hiring decisions. So often, and this happens to us every month, we'll go into a partnering agency, and because we're so interested in data, and because we're constantly looking to broker a data use agreement with them, they'll kind of giddily come up to us and say, Angela, we've just hired a new tech team. Now we keep telling them the importance of getting developers, getting data scientists, getting a team put in place, and they'll say they've hired their team, and then you'll meet people on the team, and the credential of the person is that they can program a formula in Excel. They can put a formula into Excel, and to that person who hired them, that was genius. But to those of us who want to move the field forward, this is not the right person in the right job at the right time to get this agency to where it needs to be. And some of them can be trained up, but they don't know how to hire, and they also don't know how to hire teams of technologists that can work together. So it's going to take a while to get the workforce development in place, and the workforce development on getting the tech needs taken care of the government sector. But there's two other biggies that if we don't resolve are going to be problems. The one is contracts lawyers that are ready for tech and AI. So in a lot of our government partner agencies, they broker agreements with tech companies or data companies that are going to do data work for them, and they don't know how to write the contracts in a way that can protect themselves. So often they give up their data, and they give up access to their data. I mean, it's horrific how some of our counties don't even own their own data anymore and just can't get it. So it's a little bit of a wild west out there that we need contract lawyers that can write agreements that allow the public to benefit from AI and technology, but that's going to take workforce development too. And then the third one, which is true, it's true at the federal level, but it's very true at the state and city level too, is it's the regulators who understand the field. And that's very hard to do because the field changes so quickly, but you need people who understand what they're regulating to be able to put regulations in place. If you need guardrails, I mean, the regulators are the people who are supposed to provide those guardrails, but they have no idea of what it is they're regulating. So this is a problem in general. It's not just at the state and local level, but we're going to have to resolve these workforce issues. We need to develop a workforce that's ready for this, and that's going to take a while.
Yeah, that's just tough. I feel for people hiring tech people and AI people. I'm an AI person, but if you ask me to hire someone, I don't completely trust myself either. I need 3 other people, to weigh in, to see whether someone's really good. So, and
you understand the skills. I mean, you know the skills that you're looking for. I mean, they don't even know what they should be looking for. They wouldn't know where to begin in terms of writing a job responsibility.
It's so hard to, unless you ask the right questions, you have the right knowledge, you have people who ask the right questions, it's very difficult to know how good someone is. I tell people that, one right person is, the equivalent of 100 sort of mediocre people.
Yeah.
I mean, literally and without exaggeration.
Absolutely. The other thing I think in terms of workforce development, I think schools of public policy and schools of government around the country should really be integrating more with the tech side of campus. So with data sciences, with computer sciences, these schools need to come together. And there's some places where programs will pay lip service to this, but it does. Nobody should be graduating from any government school or public policy school now with some appreciation for what this wave of tech is going to mean for these institutions.
So talking about government, right? There's the Doge initiative is front and center these days, Musk and Ramaswamy. How do you think about that? What will success look like?
So no one doesn't have a strong opinion about this. Everybody either thinks the sky is going to fall or this is the beginning of a great future. I do think that this team will find that it's very difficult to cut the budget at the sort of level that they're talking about. You're talking about $1 trillion or $2 trillion of cutting and spending. It's a very difficult thing. I used to teach when I was at Pepperdine classes in social policy, and one of the first things I do was have my students do an exercise where they had to actually cut the budget. And again, I had students on all sides of the aisle. And even the staunchest fiscal conservatives, by the end of the week, were banging their heads and realizing how very difficult it is to do because of all these entitlements. And it's very unpopular to take away things that people have. And there's always a risk of midterm elections or the next wave of elections. So if they do it badly, what is this going to mean? So you're going to find a lot of risk aversion when it comes to actually cutting things. Improvements in efficiency are one thing, tech transfer, improving tech is another, but actually cutting. I do think the biggest gift they could give us if they would take this seriously and could really focus on a few issues is improving digital public infrastructure, improving technology, not just at the federal level. The feds, most government employees are not federal; they're state and local employees. But the federal government can influence how state and local governments behave and how money is passed through to them. And we work with a lot of government partners that receive money from the federal government to do something. And often the innovation money comes from the federal government. It's off their budgets. They apply for something that money comes to them. So they respond to these requests for proposals. If they really took this seriously, they could, in these requests for proposal, have requirements around making sure they're standing up their technology, making sure they're standing up their data resources. If we could just get digitized appropriately, make sure that we have the digital infrastructure that we need, we can see massive improvements in efficiency, massive cost reduction, and also massive improvements in how we serve the public. I don't think it has to be a trade-off.
I think AI can really help simplify and improve governance by making sense of existing processes, identifying conflicts, duplication, contracting, fraud, and all that kind of stuff. I think governments just become too complex and ingrained, and the budgets of agencies are huge, like in the hundreds of billions. And it's like an opaque machine. I mean, something like 1 in 7 people work for the government.
So, Vasant, I think you're right. It's not just that you as an outsider looking into these entities are wondering, how does this work? Economists begin to get your head around it. Even within these entities, they often don't know how they're working. We did a little exercise on trying to see, how there was a lot of interest in community violence intervention and just trying to figure out, even the money flows, what's flowing where, what's being used for what. We could never track it down. It's impossible to understand what's happening. We are going to be able to get much more insight into the drivers of cost, whether it's be contracting. I know certainly on the DoD side, the Musk and team have already said they really want to take a close look at government contracting. Those large caches of data that can be used to draw insight about where the drivers of cost are, and we will soon.
And also risk, right?
Risk.
Because a lot of, we waste gazillions of dollars on initiatives that we know are not going to go anywhere.
And this is where I think you will find consensus across the aisle, where there's obvious waste, where there's obvious fraud, and there is that. I think the first 5%, 10% is going to be a relatively easy task. It's digging deeper than that things are going to get complicated quickly. But I think there'll be bipartisan support for the silly stuff, and I think there'll be agreement on that. The problem is, cutting where Washington is a political place. There are very thin margins in Congress, and people are very worried about losing their constituencies. So, there has to be consensus about where you're going to cut, and there has to be kind of some agreement from the public about where to cut. Now, will this team be consensus builders is the question mark, right? Will they be able to help to get that consensus because again, they're only an advisory. They can make it. They can give advice. They can't directly implement.
So what do you think success would look like realistically?
For me, it would look like a government that is leaner but more effective and is able to do the task of government well, protect law and order, provide services to people who need those. And we all disagree about what the role of government is, but I think it would be a leaner government that does more with less. And I would love to see us be a country that's moved. I really feel we're slipping behind, and you and I go to India a lot, Vasant. Our digital public infrastructure, I don't think we're even having the conversations yet about what this country needs to put us in the right place for the new tomorrow, and would love to see those sorts of investments. And I really do think Musk could do a lot in pushing AI and technology in the government sector and really creating an atmosphere where there's a will to do that. I think people are really worried about running afoul of him. So he could really push that agenda more effectively than almost anybody I know. And I hope he steps up to that. But that means keeping out of some of the other battles. I don't want to fight the $50 million battle about bear DNA. Really, they should. And there's a lot of ways and they can cut that out. But I think more importantly, we need to keep our eye on the prize. If they've got 18 months, they need to do some things well. And tech transfer into the government sector could be one of those things.
All right, cool. Well, let's hope that works.
I hope so too.
Well, Angela, thanks so much. I see we have exceeded an hour, and I try and not exceed it by too much. But thanks so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Vasant. Always fun to see you.
Thank you, and have a great rest of 2025.